Hello and welcome to episode 139 of Aviadev Insight Africa, the podcast offering a window to African aviation with your host, John Howell, CEO and founder of Aviadev Africa. Today's guest is a very familiar name to many of you on the continent and beyond, and a great friend of Aviadev. Raphael Kuuchi is the Special Envoy to Africa on Aeropolitical Affairs at the International Air Transport Association, or IATA. IATA has been a leading voice, of course, through the pandemic, and today I wanted to get an update and to understand what the current key messages are coming from IATA and how, as an industry, we can support their efforts and work together to rebuild our great industry. So welcome to the podcast, Raphael.
Thank you.
Great. So for those who have sort of come across you and were intrigued by that job title, because it's not a normal job title, give us all a bit of an overview of what it is, why you were appointed and what it was you were appointed to do and what your role entails.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to update you on where IATA is currently with the COVID and all that we all are being impacted by. I was made a special envoy to Africa on Aeropolitical Affairs about 2 years plus now. And the reason why IATA created this role was we felt Africa was rolling out key aviation and tourism development initiatives at the continental level. And IATA wanted to support these initiatives so that they can become a reality and that for the African aviation sector to rise up and take its rightful place. If you would recall that in times past, we had continental initiatives that never were very successful. And we thought this time round, we needed to have somebody who could work much closely with the top level government and organization leadership on the continent to provide the necessary support that can ensure that we have what Africa is doing properly aligned with what the global expectations are, and also give it the necessary push so that we are able to bring it to reality. So they created the position of Special Envoy on Aeropolitical Affairs. And my task was actually to work with the African Union Commission, the regional economic communities, the industry associations on the continent, and individual states at the highest level, trying to build the consensus that we need in the aviation sector and provide them all the support that IATA can lend to ensure that we have a successful rollout of the single African air transport market, the continental free trade area, as well as the free movement of people and goods that is driven by the ease of visa acquisition and access.
Great. And I will come back to SAATM and we'll talk about the successes and where we're up to and get a bit of an update of that in time. But of course, I wanted also to understand about IATA generally has been really vocal, of course, as we expect through the pandemic. So the key messages coming from HQ, coming from Mr. De Juniac, what is it that IATA right now is sort of banging the drum about the loudest?
Well, as you would know, the industry is on its knees and struggling to really come up because travel by air literally collapsed a few months back. And even though we are seeing a restart of the industry, it is not where we expected and we had forecast it to be. So IATA's message, which is also the message of the International Civil Aviation Organization and other bodies who drive air transport connectivity across the globe, is for us to ensure that we have alignment and consistency in the way we are applying measures, particularly health-related measures and protocols for the industry restart. We have seen in different parts of the world. The restart is coming up, but we are seeing conflicting messaging. We're seeing conflicting policies and protocols. We are seeing duplication of efforts. IATA's a message to the industry and to governments in particular, and the health authorities is, can we talk to each other and have some alignment in the way passengers are treated with regards to the health measures we are trying to. If we don't do this, we are continuously creating anxiety in the traveling public, and as a result of which many people would rather not travel. In other words, IATA is saying that policies related to quarantine need to be relooked at carefully. IATA's belief is that testing that is accepted across countries and across networks is what the industry needs at this point to boost confidence of the traveling public. To avoid a situation where passengers would arrive at a destination and are quarantined contrary to their expectation that they were going to go through the airport and proceed to their business. So we're seriously encouraging governments to relook at the quarantine measures, adopt more acceptable testing mechanisms before travel so that we avoid the quarantine. You can appreciate that, for instance, you go for a COVID PCR test before your travel and you're negative, but then you arrive at a destination and they conduct another test and they tell you you're positive. And because of that, you've got to go into 14 days mandatory quarantine. It defeats the whole purpose. So as a passenger, unless you are sure that I would get clearance in my destination country, I will not even travel at all. And that's why we want the governments to trust each other with a test mechanism so that people can begin to move around. That's the first message IATA is passing on. The second message is the industry is still bleeding. Airlines are still suffering, and we want the measures that we were advocating initially for governments to provide financial support to the industry. We want those supports to continue. And these measures are direct financial injection to the airlines, loans to the industry, and loan guarantees wherever possible to the industry. In addition, we also want governments to consider the waiving of some taxes that are imposed on the industry. Or if they don't want to waive or they cannot waive for whatever reason, the deferment of the payment of these taxes so that the industry can have a breathing space. Because as it is, airlines are not generating the revenues they need, but their costs is still what it is. And so the airlines need some breathing space to be able to continue to. The third element is for governments to ensure that even as we are opening up, we should have justifiable reasons for actually blocking other countries or other operators from accessing our markets. Normally, we would expect that if governments were talking to each other and if the health protocols were aligned, once you open up, then you open up to the world. But because of this inconsistency in government protocols and the health protocols across countries, we are seeing some countries, and the Europe is particularly guilty of this. The EU is regularly issuing a list of countries that are allowed to come into the EU and others that are not as yet. And the basis of actually arriving at this list is still not too clear to some countries. Now, what we are seeing is that some countries are beginning to reciprocate and saying, okay, so if the EU is saying my citizens cannot fly into the EU, then EU operators cannot fly into my country. This is, the most recent was Nigeria, who says, look, I mean, we're going to apply this. We don't want this in the industry. Aviation is a global business, and with restrictions such as these, it is not healthy for the growth of the industry. And IATA is saying, let us open up and let us do things in a consistent manner so we can have the business going forward.
Absolutely. And yeah, we've seen that obviously in Europe, and me being based here, we're kind of ahead of the African curve in terms of reopening, and some countries like the UK, we never really closed. We've just changed our policy on quarantine. We change it. You know, this is a whole different subject, but we've had exactly those travel advisories where we're giving people who are potentially already on holiday or on a business trip 24 hours to get back when they're not planning, when they only just arrived. Otherwise, they've got to go into mandatory quarantine and there is no testing. So I totally agree with the EU has been ineffective because the governments have overridden what they've said, and they've kind of said, well, we're going to do our own thing when it comes to this. And that's why when I've been talking to people on the African continent, where a lot of international borders will open in 10 days time on the 1st of October, how do we make sure that when we open, we stay open? And how do you see it right now, 10 days out, in terms of the protocols? Because I don't think we know all of them for all of the countries yet. I think we're still waiting for lists and for policies and things. But do you feel quite positive about the outlook once we open the borders on the 1st of October?
Yeah, I'm quite optimistic about the opening up in October. What we just need clarity on is for the governments who are opening up from the 1st of October to actually be very clear on what the health measures are and what the expectation of arriving and departing passengers are. But whatever measures they want to put in place, our strong recommendation is that we should, as much as possible, eliminate the element of quarantine. If there is a way we can reassure ourselves before passengers get onto our territory that those passengers are negative and safe to come into the country, then once they get into the country, they should have the freedom to go about their business. So it's all about the governments making sure that there's absolute clarity on the mechanisms. If there is no clarity, then passengers will still continue to adapt the wait and see approach. Let me see how things go. Probably by November, I'll be sure whether I can be able to travel or not. And then November comes, you see, they've been doing this and that. So no, I'll move it to December. And we're going to actually also impact the last quarter of the year, which is actually the Christmas peak season for travel, but which is what we don't want to. It is true that we need to take all the caution that is required, but we should also be able to ensure that passengers are able to get into their destinations and go about their duty. And that if for any reason passengers are unable to travel, they should be stopped at the point of departure rather than at the point of arrival. Mm. That should be the way which we need to look at this.
Yeah, because who wants to take that cost? The traveler doesn't want to take it. Their insurance company, the destination they've arrived in doesn't want to have to deal with this. They've also got the disease there. So it all comes down to absolutely putting those things in. And for those people who think that, the 1st of October and then everything will come back. It's absolutely what you're saying is right. That isn't the case. It's going to be, okay, let's see whether it's working for the small number who first make that journey. And if it is good, then we will build confidence. But if it isn't good, those stories will erode confidence. They'll push this down the line, and we'll be in the same position. So I totally with you. So let's talk a little bit about the government side of things, and we'll get on to open skies. But in terms of the African governments that you speak to, that you lobby and you work with, of course, we are aware that this pandemic has affected economies across the world in so many different ways. And it's not just African governments, but all governments around the world are having to deal with different competing priorities for the small amount of resources that they've got financially. So do you feel that they're prioritizing aviation? We haven't seen loads of communication generally across the continent about here's a stimulus package. I know there was some early money put in by like Senegal, and a few other countries have put some money in for their airlines and made a sort of, a real sort of play to say, we are committing to this. But how do you feel it's been, and what is the attitude of governments? Do they feel aviation is a priority, or is it something that's further down the list?
That's a good question. The governments in Africa are overwhelmed. In fact, even in normal times, many African governments are always struggling to meet their basic budgetary financial commitments. And with COVID, it has really made the situation very difficult. However, under the circumstances, some of the countries are doing the best they can, prioritizing with the limited resources that they have, and looking at their priorities very clearly. And as you would appreciate, there are the initial concern was actually just access to PPEs. Became a very critical issue, not only in Africa, but across the world, but particularly in Africa. It was not only the lack of PPEs, but also the money to procure the PPEs. And subsequently, the air connectivity to bring in the PPEs. So through that process, African governments got to realize the importance of air connectivity. They got to appreciate that really without air connectivity, we wouldn't have been able to contain the situation to the extent we have today. So they're very appreciative of that. However, when we initiated discussions with governments through the African Union and the African Civil Aviation Commission on the need to support the aviation sector so that beyond COVID, we would still have a vibrant air transport industry on the continent, the response was overwhelmingly positive. And right from the ministers of aviation that we interacted with through the African Union to director generals of civil aviation authorities and airline CEOs, all of them were unanimous in the fact that the industry needs support and the industry should be supported. Through this process, the African Union and African Civil Aviation Commission then were able to quantify the immediate financial need of the industry in Africa. And it came to approximately $25 billion. This was way back in May. And the issue was, how do we raise this money? Then the African Development Bank said they were already putting together or mobilizing funding to support the African governments as part of the COVID relief measures. So they have mobilized some $10 billion. So, but this is not just money for aviation, it is meant for COVID relief. But governments who access this funding can consider extending part of this support to the aviation industry. The AU itself launched a 10 billion fund to mobilize resources from member states up to the tune of 10 billion and use this to support the aviation and tourism sectors, because they were critical. We need to maintain jobs. We need the industry to continue to provide the connectivity that we need on the continent. Subsequently, the AU actually increased this fund that it had launched. It proposes to increase it to 25 billion and was expecting that states on the continent will contribute into this fund to raise the money, which will then be applied to the sector. Then the African Export-Import Bank, Afrexim Bank, also made a commitment of $3 billion to support aviation and tourism on the continent. Excellent. So in total, we had a commitment of well over $30 billion for aviation and tourism sector. Now, the challenge that arose thereafter was getting this money together, and two, the criteria for accessing this money by the airlines, by the tourism sector players. And despite a lot of engagements by the African Union, the African Civil Aviation Commission, and the aviation stakeholders on the continent to discuss and push for an earlier release of this money, unfortunately, it would appear up until now that, for instance, the funding from the ADB can only go through states, can only go through governments, but not directly through the airlines or the tourism sector. So government will access this, and then they can then decide how much of it can be extended to the aviation sector. And this is where we have the difficulty. So up until now, even though some governments have already gotten funding support from African Development Bank, the extent to which they stretch this to the aviation sector, we are not too sure. There's no clarity there, and which is unfortunate. And so airlines haven't got this. The same way for the Afrexim facility, it has to be accessed through through the states. And the AU own fund, we are not too sure. We haven't had clarity on how much has been mobilized by AU to date and how this funding can be accessed by the industry. So whilst there was overwhelming support and an appreciation of the need to support the aviation and tourism sector on the continent, to date, very limited support has actually come to the sector. As you mentioned, apart from Rwanda, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Cape Verde, and Seychelles governments, which have directly injected some funding into the sector, we have no visibility with the rest of the countries on whether they have provided any support to aviation and tourism sector or not up to date.
So it sounds a little bit like we're on our own at the moment, but hopefully that will change. But the other question that brings up is, even within, once it comes to the States, you've got a mix of private airlines, state-owned airlines, and should that money be apportioned, proportionately across, it doesn't matter who owns it, or of course a state's going to support the entities that they own. And there's just so many questions that it raises. But let's hope some of that funding is mobilized, because as soon as we feel that we've hit the bottom here and we're restarting, as you said at our Africa Tomorrow conference, it's a lot easier to restart with airlines that you've kept on life support than with no airlines. So we just can't let these die.
And that is the danger that we are drifting towards, because as we move further away from when the COVID pandemic struck the industry, the survival of airlines is getting slimmer and slimmer. And unless something is done and done sooner, our conviction is that if we wait too late, there will be no African airlines even to support in the future. And if unfortunately we lose the airlines we have on the continent, then connectivity on the continent is impacted. If connectivity is impacted, Africa's dream of actually promoting intercontinental trade will be seriously impacted, because we have a lot of landlocked countries and we cannot effectively trade using connectivity outside of the continent and back into the continent. So we need our own airlines to survive beyond COVID so that they can continue to support the economies. Besides, the contribution of aviation to the GDPs of African economies, as at August, IATA's estimates was that about 35 billion of the GDP contribution from the aviation sector to governments is at risk. We're not likely to realize that. 3.5 million jobs are at risk. Now, is that where we want to be as a continent? We need to think about it.
Yeah, 100%. And we want exactly the same thing. You know, I set up Aviadev to improve intra-African connectivity first and foremost. More so, I felt that the intercontinental stuff, you know, that battle had almost been lost and ceded to the international airlines. When you look at the numbers, that 80% of travelers were arriving on non-African airlines. So I was like, well, let's build local, let's build domestic routes, let's build regional connectivity. And we did a bit of research with our consultancy last year that said that only about 35% of the largest African cities are connected to one another, which just showed, rather than saying, oh, isn't that terrible, it's what an opportunity. And talking of opportunities, that brings me on to, you know, the crux, which everybody's sitting there going, right, I want to know what the situation is. You know, if we are in the situation that we're in, we basically are starting again with a blank piece of paper to an extent. And this unfortunate situation, if there was one silver lining from my side, I thought maybe this represents the best chance we've ever had to actually get SAATM going, because people don't have anything to protect anymore. You know, states don't have that. So, you know, using that pause to open the skies. So the people listening, of course, the single African air transport market is what we're talking about, signed in January 2018 at the African Union. You know, another incarnation, a implementation of the Yamoussoukro back from 1999 and before that as well. So does it now represent opportunity, and where are we up to as we stand here on the 23rd of September?
In fact, it presents, the current environment presents an unprecedented opportunity for the African continent to actually roll out its Open Skies program. And the reason I say so is because today there is very limited connectivity and the impact is very evident across the board. And if there is anything that has demonstrated to Africa as a whole that air transport is important, it is the COVID-19. Now, having come up with a nice policy to implement and fully liberalize the airspace, I believe the timing could never have been better than now to actually have that done. Having said that, unfortunately, the current approach of states in handling air connectivity and air travel related to the health protocols that are being put in place, in many cases, is arising suspicion between countries. And this is why today you see that some countries are open for air travel, but they are restricting their neighbors from operating flights into their countries. Now, I always say if we are talking about an open market and we're planning to roll out an open market policy, and unfortunately, COVID has come along and we hanging on the health protocols of COVID to actually make it difficult for our neighbors to fly into our countries, then we really do not either understand the essence of the single African air transport market, or we are being unduly protective of an industry which otherwise, if it were opened and made liberal, could actually support our effort in actually fighting the pandemic. So to that extent, I believe that whilst the timing is right for SAATM to be implemented, the lack of alignment of COVID-19 protocols among states and the resultant suspicion it is creating among states about who is handling COVID better than who and who is likely to be carrying COVID patients into my country, that is posing another impediment in the way of single African air transport market. And that is why at the beginning I said what we want states to do is to align their safety protocols, their health protocols, and ensure that all of us rely on testing and that those test results are mutually accepted as you move across borders so that we can begin to get the confidence back, not only for the traveler, but also for governments and for our health authorities, and create the enabling environment for us to roll out the single African air transport market. Having said that, on the policy side and the evolving side, the decision-making side of SAATM, there's still some work going on. The African Union and the African Civil Aviation Commission are continuously reviewing the agenda for SAATM implementation. And the dispute settlement mechanism, which is one of the last elements to be fixed, is nearly done. The last review session by stakeholders was done a couple of weeks back, and now it is actually up to the AU now to get it ready for adoption. And so as far as putting the framework and the steps in place are concerned, all is on track. Now, the setup of the Secretariat to monitor the implementation of the single African air transport market is also ongoing. I know some recruitments are going on in AFCAC to staff the Secretariat, get the right level of people in the Secretariat to be able to provide the support that is needed on SAATM implementation. So that work is also going on. And the African Development Bank has made a commitment to support this and has already availed funding to progress this course. So that is going on at the policy level. What we just need is for states to believe in each other and open up their markets so that we can have uninterrupted movement of passengers and goods across the continent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great to get that update and to see. I remember hearing about the ADB having the funding for AFCAC, and Tefera and the team over there are doing everything that they can. And I suppose the thing that I'm taking away from this is, in the same way that the September 11th attacks 20 years ago really changed the way that we did things from a security perspective, COVID is doing something similar, but from a health protocol perspective. And we managed to deal with that and put in the same security processes around the world, get that accepted by other countries. So we need to do the same thing. Do you see parallels and similarities with that situation? Obviously, this one's lasting a bit longer. That was a short, sharp shock and a huge shock for the industry. But this is different, but also has similar challenges.
Yes, there are similarities between the 9/11 and COVID, and but the way we're looking at COVID is to handle it in such a manner that going forward we avoid some of the mistakes that globally as an industry we made during the post 9/11 era. If you recall, up until now, there were some security measures because of lack of harmonization and alignment of security measures. We ended up post 9/11 with different security measures at different places. So you get to one airport that says, strip yourself naked before you cross the scanner. You get to another place that says, no, only your laptop out, your watch, your belt, no problem. You get to somewhere, they say, no, take all metals off you. You know, there were different protocols, and it is very upsetting to a traveler. You know, you are not too sure what to expect at an airport as far as security is concerned until you get there. Now, with COVID, we are seeing similar protocols being introduced. And that is why IATA consistently is saying, let us try and harmonize these protocols. Let us try and align them so that as a passenger, if I am moving from Nairobi to the UK, I know what health protocols to expect. You know, similar to the past where there was yellow fever was an issue, everybody got to know that when I am traveling to country A, B, and C, I need to have a yellow fever vaccination and a certificate. I carry that with me so that when it's demanded, I show it and I can go. Now, we want to have such consistency and such clarity around COVID so that we don't have a patchwork of health protocols going into the future like we did for security in the past. So that is what we want to avoid. And that is where we want governments to continuously talk to each other, involve their health authorities, the national health authorities, the World Health Organization, the CDC, all of them into formulating something that will be universally acceptable protocol, irrespective of which country you are or where you are flying to. That is the difference we want to see going forward.
Yeah, perfect. And we didn't even discuss in there, you know, when you're traveling, you also have to think about your visa policy and do you need this letter and all these different things. Visa on arrival, apply before, send your passport off. You know, these things, they just affect confidence, but they affect demand because they make friction on the journey, on your planned trip. So before we go, I wanted to ask you, you know, what can we do as an industry? You've got industry people listening. So, you know, what can we do to support your efforts? And, you know, like, what would you like to see right now?
What we would appreciate all stakeholders in the industry to do is to continuously engage in the sensitization of our stakeholders, the governments, and the traveling public. Look, at best, COVID-19 is here to stay with us. We might not, until we get a vaccine, we will need to manage the situation. And we should not continue to constrain the economic development and growth of the world by actually sitting at one place and doing nothing about it. We need to observe all the protocols that are out there and that have been put out there by our health authorities and the World Health Organization, but we should keep going about our activities. So for people who have to travel to make things work, please observe the protocols, but do for travel. For people who need to go on tourism, as long as the tour sites are available, forever go on those tours, because we need to create that sensitization. We need to let people be aware that, look, things are getting back to normal. They're not there yet, we are hoping that there would be a fast track of getting a vaccine, which will then bring the whole issue to rest, hopefully. But until then, we cannot just fold our arms and be at one place. Let us continue to get some activity going, get the economies moving, so that we can support each other. Now, to the governments, let us also let governments understand that, particularly in the Africa region, they should understand that COVID should not be an opportunity to make money out of the few people who decides to travel by air. We are seeing that in some countries there are duplicated COVID testing, and the amounts that are being charged for a COVID test are not reflective of the cost of the test. In other words, don't actually depress further an already depressed travel sector by introducing additional costs to the industry. Make it much easier for people to travel, make it much more cost effective, apply all the protocols. If you have to test, do test, but please just make the cost commensurate with the cost of the test, so that we can encourage more people to travel. But also we need to get governments to understand that they need to be very clear and consistent in the policies that they are rolling out. You cannot announce that we are open, anybody can come in. As long as you have a certificate, you come in and your temperature is within a certain range, you are free to go into the country, and passengers arrive and they say, no. That is not, you didn't get it right. Now you have to go into a quarantine. It actually scares people away from travel. We need consistency in the policies we are going to apply. And IATA has always asked all the states to provide this information about what health protocols they are introducing to the IATA thematics team, so that we can put it in a centralized database that is accessible at all airports, at all travel ticketing points by travelers, so that people can be informed and be guided accordingly. That is the way we want to go, and we're encouraging governments to do that. So let us all get involved in the sensitization process, and in encouraging governments to actually make travel much more safer.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the interim, there is developments in terms of tests. They're becoming more efficient, cheaper, quicker, all those things that we need. And we're not in control of that. But when they come in, if they are showing the right level of accuracy, then we need to be sort of behind those as well. And I know that's right. Something that you guys are pushing quite hard as well. Yeah. So last question for you then. Yes. You know, we're as positive as we can be here at AviaDev. I'm personally so upset that I haven't been to the continent for 6 months, and I don't know when I'll next be going. But how positive are you about the future of aviation in Africa, and obviously on a global scale as well? But let's talk about Africa.
I think I'm absolutely positive that aviation in Africa will bounce back, and will bounce back much stronger than it had been in the past. I think what aviation is just waiting for is for consistency in policy and protocols to be rolled out by governments, and a reassurance that they will not get stranded somewhere along the line, and travel would just bounce back. I'm beginning to see that in some of the routes within Africa that travel has resumed, the passenger numbers are picking up very quickly, and we're thinking that as long as we maintain the momentum and there's consistency, we are going to see the numbers grow in leaps and bounds. We cannot do without air connectivity, and that is a fact of life. It doesn't matter what technology we have today. It is still important at some point or another for us to sit on that plane and move from one place to the other to get things done. And this will continue. Africa is a growing region. other means of transport on the continent are less developed than air transport. So air transport and air connectivity becomes the most efficient and cost-effective in terms of time and money to linking up the continent. And so I cannot see air transport in the continent depressed for longer. No, all we're just waiting for is to get clarity on the way forward, and air transport will bounce back in leaps.
Wonderful. Well, the next, as we said at the beginning, the next couple of weeks are going to be really interesting in that. And I think that absolutely, I agree with you. I've been just couldn't have said it better in terms of the lack of alternatives to get people around and to develop business and to bring tourists from one place to another. It's just too important. And I think if it has highlighted something, like you said, it's the value of aviation to Africa. This pandemic has really shown the governments just how important it is, and they need to now put it front and center in their recovery plans as well, and protect what's left and support what's left as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Raphael. I would have loved to have been having a coffee with you in Nairobi today. But unfortunately that's not possible yet, but I'm sure we'll be back together soon. So thanks so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And thanks so much also for your time. Enjoy the rest of the time and keep doing your bit to flatten the curve.
We'll do our bit. I'm not leaving. So yeah, thank you everybody for listening today. And as always, all that we ask in return is that you share this episode with one person in your network you think would benefit from having a listen. Don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and we'll see you for the next episode very soon. Thanks for joining us.